Well, I think there are lots of different ways in which it's important. There's a much stronger strand of research about emotion or that problematises emotion within the social sciences that's developed over recent years. So it's a kind of theme that's come through in a whole range of different disciplines. So that made it an obvious topic. I guess I've been really interested in working very much with the student experience, with students' experiences of being PhD students of doing research as well. So there's a kind of process strand that fits with that more substantive strand.
We thought we should get you out of your chairs first thing, and just to keep your energy up after the lunch. So we're going to do something that we've been doing in knowledge exchange workshops, which is a continuum. And we're going to ask you to roughly line yourselves up from about here to the chairs that are stacked in front of the desk there, according to how comfortable, confident you are talking about emotions in research and emotional research. And you can interpret those words confident and comfortable however you want to. And then we're going to get a picture of where people are at with this topic. What we're looking at.
Where's the start?
So the very confident can be up at the front, and the less confident can be down towards the chairs at the end. We will start maybe at the confident end.
Well, I'm doing history, so most of my subjects are dead, so the way I deal with the emotions is a bit different to social sciences.
I'm doing clinical psychology, but I explore mood, then emotion, mostly mood, anxiety and depression, so I'm quite comfortable to speak about my emotional state or emotional state of others.
I just enjoy talking about myself.
Well, I'm a sociologist here in the school, and I was thinking pre-talk I'd normally be down there, but if Liz is here, I'll show solidarity and move on.
I'm researching violence against women, and I've been a support worker for the last 10 years with Women's Aid and Rape Crisis, so I feel confident talking about these things.
We were saying that I'm about 60% scraping a B pass. I quite like talking about myself and to other people, but I haven't quite put it into practice in the research yet.
Yeah, I'm similar to Cara. I've been doing research in prisons and the community with very vulnerable people for, quite a long time now, about 8 years. And I really enjoy it, and I actually think it's really useful. And be quite open about how you feel as well as how you think participants will feel.
Yeah. More research about disability, and also people with chronic illness, so I suppose I'm very used to engaging with them about their experiences. I wouldn't say I actually share too much of my own emotions with that, but I very much enjoy hearing their tales and encouraging them to speak about themselves. So.
I suppose I think you never know what's coming, and so I have reasonable confidence, but the unexpected can occur, so I wouldn't say I'm very confident. So I'm kind of right in the middle.
I sort of echo that actually in a way, but also I think I've chosen, I said about 50%, probably because I've learned to become more comfortable with talking about emotions, and I think that's through sort of meeting different kinds of people and being in different sorts of situations. But as you say, you can never really predict exactly what's going to happen. So, I think it's a process of learning, so I put myself as a 50% mark.
Well, for me, I'm doing a PhD in public health, so I'm splitting between kind of methodology in terms of quantitative and qualitative methods. So, depending on time and the weather, I guess. One day I'm more comfortable talking about emotions and looking into the qualitative side of my project. Second day, when I'm more quantitative, it's a bit, pushed back. So.
Yes, I'm Supawan Young. I come from Queen Margaret University. I study PhD in nursing. I do qualitative research with family carers caring for children with hematological diseases. So I have a lot of family carers have emotional to have experience about emotion, so it's quite. I want to know how to bring out emotion from the family carers.
Hello. Relate to my project. I would like to understand my feeling during learn another feeling when I do field work or when I analyze my data.
I'm divided. I kind of want to be both further that way and further that way. In that, as a professional, teacher, supervisor, manager, I feel fairly comfortable with. I mean, a lot of the work I do has to manage emotions in some way. So I would tend to, in that part of my life, I want to go that way. But as a researcher, I haven't really addressed the kind of the relationship between my research and emotional emotions I play in my research. So I'm very, if I have any confidence, it's the confidence of ignorance, which places me like.
Hi, I'm Resto. I'm a PhD student in anthropology here at the University of Edinburgh. Emotion as a topic is fairly new to me, so I'm not that confident yet. And I also come from the Philippines, where expectations for men generally, at least for the middle and the upper class, is to have a large degree of emotional control and not really to talk about feelings, at least in the public sphere.
Yeah, so I suppose I'm also a bit of a quandary about where to stand, but come in the middle, kind of, because my research is about trying to find out how people emotionally respond to landscape. So I'm comfortable with emotions, but I suppose it's the expression of emotions which maybe makes me move further towards here.
I'm doing looking at domestic abuse. I have worked with Women's Aid in the past, and so I'm used to some support with. So it's the working on my own, my own emotions, working with that on my own. So that's what.
I'm a PhD student in sociology, and my work focuses on care and how understandings of care transfer in the globalisation process with migrant nurses. And even though it's care, I hadn't really factored in the fact that emotion might be a theme coming up, so I'm fairly new to the reading around it now. And also maybe how my own personally I'm going to relate to the research as well. I'm very interested in looking at that aspect too.
Hi, I'm researching the use of mindfulness, so there's a lot of awareness of emotion there, and I'm also a mindfulness practitioner. So in those terms, yes, I feel confident about emotions being aware, but I think in research terms, and even otherwise, I think there's a lot that I have to learn, or I can see there's a lot to learn. So that's what I'm thinking somewhere. Yeah, I've got that way to go to learn, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in a bit of a dilemma as well, because I'm a GP in clinical practice with an interest in palliative care and people that are dying. So in my clinical practice, I'm quite happy with talking about difficult emotions. But I'm a novice researcher, and I'm looking at emotional distress in families from a family systems perspective. So being a novice researcher, I'm down at this end.
Yeah, I'm a PhD student in social anthropology, and I research religious conversion and religious belonging. And funnily enough, that involves a lot of emotions and a lot of aspects to it, which I am interested in researching, but at the same time positioning myself is a bit difficult within that dichotomy, let's say, or kind of like, not dichotomy, but relationship. So I'm on the same position, like I feel like I have to go, like, I'm not used to talking about myself in the research, so I will want to position myself differently.
I'm doing my PhD in geography, and I'm looking at the influence of super fast internet on rural community sustainability and resilience. So it's not something that emotion typically is brought to the forefront, but when speaking to people, you'd be surprised how emotional they can get about internet and connections. So it's something I've just started to think about, so that's why I'm on this end, because I haven't gone into it.
Okay. I'm doing research that's very, very personal to me, and it's basically created my whole life. So I'm just going to start my PhD in September, so it's kind of how I will negotiate my feelings and my kind of upbringing in that research.
Similar to what some other people have said, I've got personal and professional experience in my kind of subject area, but I've no experience as a researcher, and I don't start my PhD till September as well, so I guess my position here reflects my lack of confidence and experience about the whole research process rather than anything else.
Thank you for showing us and sharing with us. And take your seats. Thank you very much. And we'll now go into your presentations. And the first presentation is from James Pryor.
I've been tasked with talking to you about researching emotional vulnerability. And the first place I want to begin is, how do we begin to define that we're researching emotional vulnerability? One of the key things that you researchers worry about, one of the most anxiety-provoking aspects of social research, relates to the welfare of our research participants and our potential to harm them or hurt them. So that's something I'm going to talk about in relation to emotional vulnerability. We have ethical codes and we have ethical procedures, and those of you that were at Tuesday's event on ethics will know about this. I spent a whole day on it. But nothing will prepare you for what happens in reality, in research, in practice. Unexpected events are bound to occur, and sometimes, if not often, these unexpected events are emotional in nature or are related to emotions in some way. Usually we make assumptions about how our research will go in practice. One of the most common mistakes we make is to assume that our research is not emotive. Internet broadband in rural areas, I just heard that example. And therefore one can quite happily go in and talk to anybody about that topic and find actually the converse is true. What appeared initially to be an unemotive topic can become quite emotive. And the converse is also true. We may think we're going in to research a particularly vulnerable client group on an emotional topic, and that will be very demanding and carry high levels of risk. And we find that those people that we meet in the course of that research are strong, resilient, clear, focused, and do not present us with challenges in research relationships. Let me give you some examples. A research colleague that I supervise, a research student, wanted to research public perceptions of mental health professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, and counsellors. She recruited from the public, self-selected people. It was not service user groups. We did not expect anything untoward to come out in the course of her one-to-one interviews. She found in the course of these interviews about public attitudes to mental health professionals that many of the people that came to speak to her had experience of mental health problems or had family experience of mental health problems and had very strong stories to tell, often got upset or even angry, and on a couple of occasions she found herself being profoundly challenged about the ethics of her professional training through engaging in this very open way with members of the public. She was left feeling that she had underestimated the emotiveness of the topic. She had not built in sufficient support for the participants and for herself. The converse can also be true. I went and did a piece of research with school pupils aged between 13 and 17 who had attended school counselling. In my mind, I had made them a fragile participant group. I imagined they would find it very difficult to talk to me about their experience of counselling, about the problems that they brought into counselling, about what happened during counselling. The reverse was true. I met these really rather bolshy, self-assured young people with stories to tell who wanted to tell me how good the counselling had been and how much they had learned, and for the most part had no qualms and no problems telling me about the problems and difficulties that brought them into counselling. So there for me was an experience of where I felt in retrospect I had been deeply patronising about the emotional vulnerability of this service user group, of this population group. And it's still the case today when you look at ethical codes, including our own ethical codes at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm sure in other universities, one of the questions will be, are you researching particularly vulnerable service user groups such as children and young people? Now those of you that work with children and young people will know that's often not the case. Just because they're children and young people, they're not necessarily vulnerable. So I think these are important points that we need to bear in mind. Another common assumption that we make when we're going in to do research with people is that if people become upset in the course of their contact with us, then we have done them harm. we have caused this, we have made them unhappy, distressed, or angry. That this is a bad thing that they have become emotional, and that we are responsible for having caused it. I would like to challenge all of that thinking, which is common particularly for novice researchers, including myself as a novice. Our job as researchers is to ensure we have informed consent, to be clear about what we're doing there, to be clear about what we're asking, what our questions will be about, etc. We invite stories and narratives, we invite opinions, we may create group discussions on particular topics, we encourage people to tell us about their lives and their experiences. People are holistic and embodied beings, as we will hear from other presenters today. Reason and emotion are inextricably intertwined. Emotions will have their place, whether implicit or explicit, in people's stories and accounts about almost anything. Emotions are always present in relationships. They may emerge directly and be expressed or spoken about directly. They may run under the surface of an encounter and go unexpressed, but nonetheless be felt by people. And again, my colleagues will talk about that today. Even the absence of feeling can be regarded as an emotional occurrence. This person told me about a very difficult experience, yet they showed no emotion, and I felt nothing. There is an emotional occurrence going on there, even though it may be by the absence of emotion. The research relationship is no different to any other relationship in this respect. Even if it's only a one-off encounter, there is relating between two or more people going on while they are together, just like there is between me and yourselves as you're listening to me today. So emotions are intrinsic and inevitable. They cannot be excluded or prevented. They cannot be regarded as separate from or alien to research and practice or the data that we collect. So, for example, when a research student says to me, the participant became upset at this point, so I stopped the interview, I usually reply, why did you stop the interview? And the usual answer that I get is something like, they were upset, so they could no longer continue with the interview. Or the student might say, I realized I was causing them harm because they were getting upset, so I needed to stop. Now, behind both of these responses, in my opinion, lie misunderstandings about the research relationship and the place of emotional expression within it. Firstly, emotions are an inevitable part of human encounters and they cannot be eradicated, as I've said. They're not extraneous to the research. The participant has given fully informed consent to participate in the research. They're in charge of themselves and their conduct. We have not made them upset. They have become upset. There's a big difference about attribution of responsibility. Thirdly, we overestimate their fragility. We patronize or even infantilize our participants when we decide that they have become so upset that they cannot proceed. It's our task on these occasions to consult and negotiate with the person about continuing, stopping, taking a break, etc. Taking ethical principles into account, we need to balance non-maleficence, doing no harm, with respect for autonomy, which is about letting other people, in this case our participants, decide what is in their best interests, to continue, to stop, etc. Too often, researchers in our anxiety prioritize the former, non-maleficence, over the latter, respect for autonomy. And perhaps I would argue this is a reaction to the appalling violations of human rights that have happened in some research in the past, like the Milgram experiment, the Tuskegee experiment, etc. In my opinion, the authors of one of the papers that you were offered to read today, the Clark and Sharp paper, those authors fall into this error, I think. The Taliban is an error. So what do we need to do to work respectfully with the emotions of our research participants? We need to not make assumptions either that our research is unemotive or profoundly emotive. We need to stay open to the opposite being the case. We need to expect the unexpected, like some of you have already mentioned. Secondly, we cannot all become therapists or social workers, but we need to ensure that we have the necessary skills and knowledge to respond in the research context to what may emerge. We should pilot interviews and focus groups. We should consider role-playing and working with colleagues. And very importantly, we should put ourselves into the role of the research participant. Imagine being in the receiving end of us as a researcher and the kind of questions we've got to ask. So we should really attend to that. We need to develop our reflective thinking about the issues under investigation. My colleagues will say more about this today. We need to be prepared to face our own feelings. It's often the case that we freeze and become uncomfortable and anxious when some of our own material is being touched in the course of our contact with other people. We assume that they are upset or troubled when actually it is we who are upset or troubled. But of course we're the invulnerable researcher, so we're less likely to admit that. And we need to bring all of these topics to research supervision, to peer conversations, to conversations with other people. We need to keep talking, thinking and feeling, and thinking about feelings. And finally, we need to build in the necessary support for ourselves in relation to the emotional labour involved in social research. And that's a term I use from Hofschild about there's emotional work for us when we interact with other people, even if it's only one-off meetings. Melrose emphasises this, and again in the paper that you were given today, where she was conducting interviews with young women in the sex industry and realised the huge impact these interviews were having on hers, which she had not foreseen. So let us all learn from the experience of others who published in these areas. I'll pass now on to my colleague Julie.
I'm going to talk about this idea of emotional reflexivity. I think it's very difficult to talk about emotions in research or researching emotions without engaging with this concept of reflexivity that we're all meant to understand. So I'm going to say something about the relationship between emotions and reflexivity, and then some of the methodological implications of that. And in the spirit of reflexivity, I thought I'd share with you a reviewer's comments on something I attempted to write on emotional reflexivity. Now, this may have the risk or the cost that you think I'm not the best person to lead you through this concept, but it was a quick way into what some of the issues might be. So the reviewer said, and these were the nice bits, several times the author seems to confuse reflexivity with emotionality. No analytical distinction is made or developed between reflexivity and emotionality. It is one thing to be emotional or to have emotional experiences. It is another thing to be emotionally reflexive. So there are two questions at least jumping out there, and one is reflexivity always about emotions? Does it have emotion built into it? And Seamus touched on that. And is being emotional, having an emotion, enough to say that you're being reflexive? So those are two questions. But to think about those, and Liz is right, I should have built in some builders into the old slides here because you're getting all in a oneer. But to address those questions, we have to step back and we have to think about this concept of reflexivity. And most of you as researchers will know the concept to mean something along the lines of our critical awareness of how knowledge is produced or what constitutes knowledge. That tends to be how as researchers we think about it. And so you hear people talking about researcher positionality or methodological reflexivity, and those are all about this notion of critical awareness of our role as a researcher. But as Seamus has also pointed out, it's not just the researchers who are reflexive. The people we're interviewing, in fact everyone, we're all reflexive actors. We're all able to engage in the process of thinking about ourselves and ourselves in the social world. And as Margaret Archer, a sociologist, would put it, that's how we make our way through the world. We all have that capacity. So the first point, I'm only at the first one, the first point is that we're not talking about reflexivity then, we're talking about reflexivities. We have to be engaging both with the participant and our own reflexivity. Now, increasingly, social scientists have got worried that the way we've been talking about reflexivity, either researcher or participant, has become too cognitive, it's become too individualistic. So where are the emotions, people are starting to ask. Now, there's a long history of that within feminist research, but as usual, people are coming to it as if it's never been raised before. So where are the emotions? And one response to that is to argue, well, actually, we live in a society where reflexivity is increasingly emotional. We're drawing on our emotions more than previous generations. Other people might argue, no, actually, emotions are built into what reflexivity is, so it doesn't matter what generation you're talking about. Reflexivity has emotions built into it. It's not an optional extra. So this returns us to that question then that the reviewer had. Is having an emotional experience then, being emotional, the same thing as being reflexive? And whilst we may argue that emotions are key and built into reflexivity, for me that's a slightly different argument to saying emotions are reflexivity. And that not least because we can have emotions without acknowledging them. We can have emotions that are so habitual or embodied that we wouldn't even be aware of them as emotions. So I'm arguing here for emotions as built into reflexivity, but not a complete conflation of what the two are, and I'll come back to that. So far you've probably already got a sense that I think it's impossible to talk about this subject without talking about what emotions are. And that's a huge subject. What's the ontological basis of emotions? But you can already hear in Seamus, from what Seamus has said and what I'm saying, and what Liz will go on to say, that already we're dealing with different interpretations there, whether they're embodied, whether they're cognitive, someone from the Philippines talking about whether they're cultural, all these different dimensions. It's impossible to ignore that when we're talking about researching emotions. And we also can't ignore epistemological issues of how can we know what an emotion is? You know, how can we say, oh, that's an emotional expression? You know, I blush during this presentation, I seem anxious, I'm expressing emotion, but if 2 days later I say to a colleague, oh, you should have seen me at the summer school, I was so anxious, is that still an expression of emotion? So how we know what an emotional is and what an emotional expression is wrapped up with these debates too. So what does all this mean methodologically? Well, I just want to make 2 points, which you wouldn't know from that slide, but there's 2 points in there. The first one is this notion of we are always working with reflexivities, not reflexivity. And you might not always get that from reading sociological or social scientific accounts, because often as researchers we prioritize one rather than the other. And that seems an odd position, because if research is co-produced, then they can't be in competition. We need to have a sense of both. My second point is to argue that emotions, they do matter, they have intent, they can constitute data, but they're not what Peter Coldy calls the final arbiter of what's going on. And the reason for that is because of all that messiness that I've just been explaining, because of all those problems about how do we decide what's to count as emotional. So much gets written out of our accounts that if we were only to go on what a researcher acknowledges as an expressed emotion, then we will be missing a lot. And as social scientists, as Seamus has said, we are guilty a lot of the time of either having our heads turned by the dramatic emotion
And so all those mundane, socially efficient emotions just go over our head because they're working, they don't seem disruptive, so we don't clock them. And so, you know, if you do methods that allow for post-interview notes, sometimes you'll have researchers saying it was an unemotional interview, there was no emotion in it. And that's very revealing, as Seamus said, of what constitutes emotions, what do we allow to be called emotional. We also tend to prioritise the verbal. Again, if people are not verbally expressing emotion, we may miss a lot of the different ways in which we can embody emotion. There's also the issue about who gets to decide what was emotional and what wasn't. And this too touches on this issue that as postgraduates you'll be struggling with, which is the interpretive rights of any research encounter. Who gets to decide that what went on in that interview was all about anger or all about love or all about anything? So there are issues around interpretive rights. And when these surface, either in the interview or in the writing up of the research, there are ethical issues around who gets to claim what the emotions in the interview or the research were. Now, I've just got a few minutes left, and I just wanted to say something about what does this mean for actual methods. You know, you touch on all these big issues around what emotions are and epistemological issues of what gets to count as knowledge about emotions. But then when you get down to designing your study, what does all of this mean for methods? And there isn't time to go through all the individual methods you might be considering, but I think a generic question you might want to consider is this question of whether we need new methods in order to explore emotional lives and emotional relationships. And there's lots of people who are arguing within the social sciences that we do. And I have a lot of patience with those arguments, but equally, I'm wondering if we take seriously emotional reflexivity, whether we could also there's analytic purchase in being more emotionally reflexive about the methods that we do have already, and those can be the traditional surveys, qualitative interviews. Is there more analytic purchase from being reflexive about them? Or do we have to have camrecorders attached to our heads and be able to gather emotions through mobility research in that way? So I'll stop there. Thank you. And I'm passing over to Liz.
Okay, something I've been really interested in recent years is how as researchers we make use of our emotional experience. And I think that clearly connects with what Julie has said. And I'm going to try to provide a little bit of an overview and just point to some of the resources we might use. So I guess I'm starting really from the question of whether researchers' emotional experiences can be understood as data. And that, to pose that question is to take distance from a traditional view of the researcher as detached, as neutral, as objective, and as unfeeling, which has been criticised from many, many perspectives. So throughout qualitative research, that traditional view has been challenged from a variety of directions. And one strand of that is to say that whatever we do in the field, we cannot retain a neutral, unemotional, uninvolved position. We are bound to be engaged just by virtue of our interest in a particular topic. So that to me is an important starting point, together with the idea that as, particularly in qualitative research, but actually I'd argue in all kinds of research, the research can't get done without us engaging ourselves as human beings with all our idiosyncrasies. We can't get interested in something without it actually having that kind of, that personal human feeling about it. We're not just dictated to by the existing research. So if researchers' feelings are not only inevitable, as I'm suggesting, but might they also be considered as a resource and therefore as a kind of data? So are they a form of, if you like, a form of intelligence? Can we think of our feelings as a form of intelligence? Now, implicit in I guess, leaning to a positive answer to that question, is the idea that to learn about the world, to engage about the world, to come to know things, is something that we never only do cognitively. We do it also as embodied feeling creatures. We're not just our cognitions, and indeed cognition, some would argue, can only happen on a basis of feeling. Feeling comes first, if you like. So that's a kind of argument we can go to underpin some of these ideas, and it takes us into the terrain that Julie has pointed towards about what do we mean by an emotion. And I'm not going to try to unpack that. I just want to, as it were, acknowledge the kind of theoretical influences that I think get carried along with arguments that researchers' own emotional experience can be viewed as a resource, it can be viewed as a source of data. If we take that line, then, well, what do we do? Where's our evidence? Now, actually, if we read through our own field notes, for example, our journals or whatever, it's usually not hard to find lots of traces of our feelings. And the article, if any of you read the piece by Kate Woodthorpe that I suggested, does exactly that. So she thought initially that she was trying to keep her emotions out of it, and eventually realised she couldn't. And then, as it were, part of that realisation was rereading much of her fieldwork material and discovering it was full of potentially useful records of her feelings. Well, and we could talk much more, and we probably will talk more later on about where's the data, where's the evidence, how do I produce it? We can come to that. But if we kind of assume that we have material that we're happy to regard as data, then how might we think about analysing that material? You will, I imagine, all be familiar with the idea of rich description. And as soon as researchers are talking about what happens around them, they're typically using feelings in order to help create those rich descriptions. And again, I think that's illustrated in the paper that the paper by Kate Woodthorpe, to which I have pointed you. There are also lots of different theoretical resources, and I'm not going to try to summarise these in any kind of way, but there are lots of theories not only of emotion but also of affect, which may help us, as it were, to see this elusive thing called emotion and to work with it and to find things that we might wish to say about it, to think with it, to reflect on what might be regarded as traces. And if you read the paper of mine that I included in the list, then that's a paper that used psychoanalytic theories to help me think about my own emotional experience and to use it in relation to understanding what might go on with others, to think of my own feelings not as telling me how another person feels, but as a human being, the only resource I've got to allow me to begin to connect with another. And part of that then is about recognising that any understanding that I have of another person is filtered through something. It's filtered through me. And I'm suggesting my emotions are part of that. And I'm suggesting that psychoanalytic ideas provide us with a resource that might be helpful. And just to pull out a couple of ideas from there, as researchers, we are often certainly in interviews, expected to do our best to establish something called rapport. And I think we might easily understand rapport as a feeling of trust developing between people. How do we know trust has developed? We may see some signals. Very often we're relying on our own feelings. And what I'm suggesting is we routinely use this concept of rapport, and we might understand it theoretically using psychoanalysis. It's by no means the only way of doing it, but it is one way. Similarly, I could talk that through in relation to empathy. In that paper, I make considerable use of the psychoanalytic concept of countertransference and suggest that it might be a potentially powerful tool to use to understand what happens in research encounters. I think it's also a very problematic tool to use in research encounters. And I'm not going to go into that now, but only to suggest that I'm not trying to propose psychoanalysis as the way of working with emotion, and certainly not as an easy way of working with emotion, but as one possible way. And that's all I want to say.
So I want to start my part of the presentation with a bit of a warning label on the box marked presenting emotion creatively. I think there's a big temptation to want to do research on emotions and to use arts-informed methods for communicating and researching because it looks like it would be fun, because it challenges the establishment, and just getting carried away with the novelty of it all. But all of our decisions in research should come back to what our research questions and goals are, to our ontological and epistemological positions, and everything should be made, every decision should be made in an informed and coherent way all the way through. So what I'm really going to talk about at first is thinking about whether creative methods are going to be useful in communicating my research or not. That's really what I want to address first. So when I'm making decisions about my research, I actually find the prepositions in my research questions to be really useful. So one of the first things to think about in doing research is my main research question thinking about emotions. So for example, I'm interested in what are emotions, what do people say about emotions, how do people in a particular culture or a particular organization use emotional terms, things like that. Or am I thinking with emotions? So in more reflexive work, what has been my own experience of X, Y, or Z, or how do I understand X, Y, or Z through my embodied experience? Now, what the other presenters have already said shows that it's very difficult to, and probably impossible, to separate thinking from emotions. I think that's one of the themes through what we've been talking about. So you're probably going to be doing a bit of both if you're working with emotions. You'll be doing some thinking about emotions, and you'll be doing some thinking with emotions. So becoming conscious of when you're thinking about and when you're thinking with. The next question, then you collect your research, do your analysis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the final question becomes, how do I best convey this research in my dissertation, in a conference presentation, et cetera, et cetera. And so again, I suggest returning to that question of prepositions, about or with. Do I want my audience to be thinking about emotions when they're reading my dissertation or my paper? Or do I also want them to be thinking with their emotions? That is, do I want to in some way impact on their feelings through my presentation or my dissertation or my paper? And I've called it standard academic writing. Makes it sound quite dire. But standard academic writing is quite good at conveying information and helping people think about a topic. That's pretty much what it's been developed for. And I'm not suggesting at all that we should throw that out. And the papers that I suggested, two of those papers, the Cornforth and the Bridget Speedy and Kemp, and the Cornforth, Lang and Wright, I think show a nice balance of writing about, thinking about some emotional topics, but also showing in some creative ways how one might think with, feel with, read with emotion as well. So I'm not saying at all to get rid of standard academic writing, but if we're interested in helping a reader to engage their emotions, I'm saying reader here because I'm mostly going to talk about written form, so there's obviously a whole range of embodied artistic forms that could be employed here. If I want them to have an emotional experience in my presentation or my reading, how might I go about doing that? And that's not something that in the social sciences we get that much training in, which is why we often turn to the arts as a field that has been more concerned with the expression of subjective experience than, say, the social sciences have. So really the main point I want to get across is to be strategic and make conscious decisions about whether you're using creative methods in your communication or not. And I also want to put in another little caveat that the idea of trying to evoke emotions in a reader is not necessarily an ethically clear zone, and that we do not want to stray into the area of manipulating readers' emotions. And certainly the arts can be employed quite well for manipulating emotions, as we see every day through advertising, which has really harnessed that field for manipulating emotions. And in fact, I'd suggest that this fear of the manipulation of emotions is one of the reasons why many people are cautious and critical of this idea of bringing emotions into academic work, is that they do not wish us or them to stray across that line between usefully evoking and acknowledging that the reader or your audience has an emotional life as well as an intellectual life, and crossing that line into trying to manipulate it. So just another word of caution. This is a whole range of arts that are drawn on by social scientists in their work, that can be drawn on, and it's obviously not a complete list. And again, if you want to embark on using these, you need to think about why you're doing it and whether it actually fits with what you're trying to do in your research question, etc. Or if you just want to do it because it's fun, you might want to take a class on the weekend in it instead of trying to put it into your dissertation. I'm just going to talk in the rest of my little piece here about the written forms of arts, because I think one is something I know more about than the others, and two is probably the easiest to integrate into standard academic writing, especially when we're talking about dissertations in the social sciences. So there are traditions that can be drawn on when venturing into this territory. There are literary traditions in the narrative arts, obviously, both nonfiction and fiction literary traditions. And if you are interested in straying into this field, I urge you to read in that area and not just read social scientists who use creative writing, but actually go out and read creative writing teachers' works, et cetera, et cetera. Two of the biggest insights from this field, for our purposes here, would be the show, don't tell. Anybody heard that phrase before? Yes, a few nods. So at most beginning creative writing courses, that will be the phrase that gets drummed into your head: show, don't tell, show, don't tell, show, don't tell. And it's very useful. And again, you don't necessarily have to do a creative writing piece. You can take some of these insights and use it to improve your standard academic writing, if you like. Show, don't tell is basically provide enough concrete details that your reader or audience can enter imaginatively into that experience, rather than telling would be the about thing again. So just if you're telling somebody that this person felt anger, that's very different than describing in detail the embodied, contextual, etc. Narrative of that person expressing what you've interpreted to be anger. And the other thing that comes out of literary tradition is the role of beauty, and I'll come back a little bit to that. But good writing is more evocative than poor writing in terms of the aesthetic quality of it. There's also a growing field of empirical research into reading narrative literature. And I think it's also useful to understand how readers read when trying to use writing creatively to evoke emotions in particular. And Miel, Kukin, and Oatley are three of the people who write a lot in this field of looking at how readers respond emotionally to texts. And I find reading their work quite interesting. They're experimental psychologists, and they generally do sort of comparisons between literary narratives and what they call expository narratives, which tends to be things like standard academic writing or legal descriptions, things like that. And they find that the students, it's generally students participating in these experiments, that they are able to transform difficult emotions through reading literary narratives and not through reading the expository narratives. And in their research, they found the three things that are needed for this evocation and processing of emotional information through reading and writing are the evocation of three types of feelings: evaluative feelings, so whether somebody likes or dislikes the piece in general; aesthetics, which comes back to that idea of the role of beauty; and narrative feelings, how people empathize with a character or respond to a setting or something like that. So one thing to take away from that is it's quite difficult to use writing, and even creative writing, to evoke emotions in a reader. So if you do want to venture into these creative ways of expressing and evoking emotion in your reader as part of your research goal of having your audience think with, not just about emotion, then it's not easy. And it requires learning a whole other field, but it can be quite rewarding. And it's perhaps because of this that there's actually very few published examples. When I was trying to find some good published examples of academic writing that's drawing on some of these literary traditions in a way that evokes emotion in the reader, I found less than I expected to. There's a lot of discussions about how it's a good thing to do that. There's probably more papers written on we ought to than there are actually using. So I think that's quite interesting, but there's a whole field open there for you if you want to take a stab at yourself. And the final thing I want to say is that the emotions that are evoked in your audience are always your audience's emotions. And we just heard about how in research it's your emotions that dominate your understandings of other people's, what other people are going through, what your participants are going through. But again, we have to remember with the reader that it's the reader's emotions, and it's their emotional history, their history of feelings, their experiences that are going to shape their reaction to what you've written. And even the soppiest advert on TV that uses all of those bells and whistles to try and manipulate you into feeling tearful or joyful can completely backfire. So this is not an area where you will have any control. What I wanted to do in the final bit of my 10 minutes was to share a piece of creative work that came out of a project that I worked on. And this is just a short little excerpt from a story, and it's using poetic transcribing, and it wasn't myself who did this piece, it was my colleague. But it's a nice short piece, and while you read it, I'll read it out loud to you actually. I want you to try and reflexively look at your own emotional response to the words. So this is a research participant's words that has been altered, edited into this short piece. Actually, I can read it off of here. I grew up as a conservative evangelical, very enthusiastic, a son of the manse. Throughout my childhood, I desperately wanted to get my father's attention. I think I got God and Father mixed up because he had the authority, and by Jove, he used it. I had polio. It was a kids' hospital. Great fun. I remember being quite sad to go home. Hospital was an insight. It was a community to which I belonged because I walked with a limp. In the new college residence, we were all new boys together, studying to be Church of Scotland ministers. There was a real good community. But underground, there was a battle between the old way and whatever the new way was to be. We moved to Cumbernauld, great people from all over the place, all thrown together in a place that had little sense of community. I think the child in me rebelled and said, I don't know where I am anymore. I was very challenged. Within 2 years, I had a collapse. The old patterns collapsed. I couldn't deny the battle. That was an awful time. There was no tradition to fall back on. Old things I'd relied on, even though I'd rebelled against them, no longer held water. It was a huge turning point. The doctor sent me to a psychiatrist. There were 8 of us in this group, who all suffered from panic. I went to that group longer than I needed, because I belonged there. It was a small group again. So there's no right or wrong answer, but just pause to think about your own emotional response and to what parts of the story and why. I think they're going to go in very different directions with it, and I think that was one of the strengths I saw. This is the first time that I saw everyone's presentation given in a row like that, and I thought it was really interesting how there were threads and connections between everything that the 4 of us said, but at the same time they were also coming from different perspectives in terms of the types of research the 4 of us are engaged in and where we take this research. And so I think that was a useful model then for a plurality of approaches for the students to take away.
It was very relevant to my PhD. I'm a novice researcher, and so any opportunity I have to gain expertise and knowledge exchange from professionals in the field and also from other people undertaking the research process.
Quite similar, yes. The topic of my research is really mindfulness, and there's a lot of dealing with emotions with people like anxiety and depression, but also because the journey of PhD is quite emotional, so I thought it's really relevant from a personal point as a researcher as well as for the research. So I thought it was really the right topic.
Sharing with people, normalising that lots of other people have exactly the same emotions as you and that you're not alone was actually very valuable.
Yeah, I mean, totally agree with that. The group work was really bringing all those things that perhaps sometimes people thinking, oh, is this just happening to me or is this happening to other people? But I also like the first part of the session where, you know, they were discussing different concepts about, you know, imagination and lots of other things that are brought into research. And I think some of the things intuitively that I thought, they almost kind of confirmed those things. I thought, oh, okay, so yeah, this is okay, this is really happening. So, yeah.
And also bringing things out from left field that perhaps, you know, I'm a GP by trade, I'm a medic, and sort of talking about creative writing and sort of other avenues that you wouldn't have maybe naturally explored because of your sort of own sort of professional and research background.
Yeah.
So it's sort of the interdisciplinaryism.
Yes. Yeah. And you know, making a decision what kind of research you're going to be doing. So yeah, really an eye-opener.